Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Digitizing Records, Transforming Ink into Insight. Before we start today's webinar, I just want to go through some quick housekeeping as part of the general kind of good processes going forwards. So first thing to note is that this webinar is being recorded. After the webinar itself, you'll get access to the recording, as well as links to some of the videos that are being shown as part of that. And with that, there'll be copies of the slides and things too. This is a listen-only webinar. As part of this process means that you won't be able to unmute yourselves to ask questions. However, what you will see on the side is a Q&A function so that you can click on that link and then post any questions you may have about the content. What I do ask is if you have any technical difficulties, please submit them via the Q&A function as well. If you can't see anything or you can't hear what we're saying, those sorts of issues, and we will have someone help deal with those issues via the Q&A function. So it's really the be-all and end-all for those elements. And afterwards, you'll get a copy of everything so that you can enjoy some of the content afterwards. And with housekeeping out of the way, I think we can jump straight into some of the content. So the way it's going to work is that you're going to be stuck with me for the next 10 minutes or so. I am Dan Rossiter, Sector Lead here at the British Standards Institution, where I'm going to talk about some of the standards that relate to good record keeping and the digitizing of records. And then after that, Paul Serin, the global lead for the built environment at IBM, is going to jump on afterwards to talk about some of the more interesting work that Paul has been doing, as well as some case studies of how IBM and Paul have managed to help other organizations to digitize their records, as well as talk about some of the ways that it positively influences elements of our industry. So moving forwards then, if I could have my next slide, thank you. What we're talking about are digitizing records. Now, there's a lot of confusion between the way these different terms get used. People will talk about digitizing, digitalizing, digital transformation, and all sorts of phrases in between. Here today, we're not talking about fancy future thinking concepts. We are talking about fairly basic and foundational elements. We want to turn something that is physical and analog into something digital. So if you've got old copies of drawings, reports, systems that are taking up space in a storage locker or in an archive somewhere, it's the process of turning those into quality digital content. And for example, quite low-level versions will be doing things like taking photographs of that content or scanning it in. And it's that sort of activity we are talking about. Next slide, please. To do so, there are three standards that I'm going to make reference to as part of this process. So I think one more click will show the standards. The main one being the technical report 13028, which is the guide to the digitization of records. And that one is more or less what these slides cover, going through that general process of how to set out a specification that you can use to digitize the records within your organization. And then the other two, BSEN 82045 Part 2, deals with document metadata, which can be a key part of your specification, as well as the published technical report 22299, which deals with good practice file formats for preservation and interoperability. Interestingly, 22299 was written by the document management industry about what are the good formats that we should use in the way that we keep and look after things. So off the back of this, these three are highly recommended documents that you look at and refer to after this webinar. So moving forwards, one of the things I wanted to just raise is that why should you digitize these records? And there are a number of advantages, some more obvious than others. Those of you who go to enough presentations will notice Lyle appearing to score you some bingo points. But in reality, we're trying to talk about the fact that we have these physical archives, like you can see on the screen. And once you digitize them, there are extra things you can do with them. Most simple being that more than one person can access that information at once. When I was in practice, we had a large microfiche record of a lot of the historical drawings for the local authority around Cardiff. And the reality was, if someone was sat there at the microfiche machine looking at that information, no one else was able to use it or have access. So there was an access backlog. Once you have scanned or digitized this content, it means that multiple people can access it at the same time because access is available concurrently. At the same time, it can be accessed from multiple or even remote locations. You now don't have to go into the room with the microfiche reader and with all the other bits of content, or head over to the local archive or to the separate building that has the storage information. You're able to access it from your mobile device, from a kind of remote server. The options are kind of explode out in terms of what you're able to do with it. Some of the other things you're able to do is actually manipulate and reuse this content, especially when we talk about older, more precious records. They need to be handled with care. However, once you've got them actually scanned in, they can be resized, they can be tweaked and changed to suit the purpose you intend to use them for. And once they're digitized, you can even improve the way that they are protected, because once you have your write protected copy, it's able to go into your normal backup procedures. If there was a fire at the office, or if there was any form of natural disasters and other things, the majority of us now have some form of backup procedures, cloud archives and other things, which means that these records are now more secure because of the multiple iterations and ability to roll back to a previous version of those files. More simply, it reduces storage space. You don't need that kind of big locker full of files if you're able to have them safe on a server somewhere. And the fact that you don't have to spend half an hour traipsing into the other building, looking through records, waiting your turn to use the machine to have access, has a general increase on organizational productivity. So there are lots of benefits to this process of turning what was a physical record into a digital record. Next slide, please. Principally, the way the standard is drafted talks about the idea of producing a master record that you then create derivatives from. Anyone listening from the BIM space, you have this idea of the native model and model renditions. It very much has that kind of a similar respect to that. The idea being that you will have a immutable, write protected master, which would be a very high quality version of the file. But then the idea is that you might create derivatives based on particular purposes you may use it for. An example I can give is you may have a master record of the OS tiles that are relevant to you as a local authority. We had a set of all the CAD ready OS tiles, and then what we would then do is we would do save as, and then either purge elements from them, simplify them, or even change the file formats then into other formats so that they can be used either in PowerPoints, as underlays for CAD drawings or other areas. So by having a high quality master and then you produce derivatives from it, you're able to create subsets that are suitable for the purposes you intend to use, which helps keep the master clean, as well as then giving you something that's more fit for purpose. Next slide, please. And in doing so, there are a number of approaches that the standard talks about in the ways that you can do these. The first, quite simply, is whether you want to do these things in-house or outsource them. If we're talking about a relatively simple process, you may be able to do it internally within your organization. Likewise, if you don't have the capabilities or the IT infrastructure to do so, you may actually want to do these things using another organization. I think some of the examples Paul is going to give a little later on will try to tie into some of these processes. At the same time, you can look at whether you want to do just-in-time, sort of on-demand kind of digitizing of records, or if it's something proactive you want to do. Bearing in mind things like the CLC's restart, reset, reinvent mantra in terms of the road to recovery. Something an organization could look at now is whether they want to look at batch digitizing records now to actually save on time and effort later as part of their process, or whether to just continue on a on-demand kind of methodology as part of it, or ultimately actually whether we want a single site for the digitizing these elements and you have a centralized archive for this, or if actually what we want to do is have a kind of a decentralized pocket of different areas where these things happen throughout the organization. Does a certain team look after and manage these records, or is it actually more distributed within your organization? So there are many different options to look at. The standard and the way it describes how to do so is flexible and sympathetic to those approaches. And the key point being that regardless of whatever approach you take, it needs to be documented and needs to be part of a quality control process. So bearing in mind things like your 9001 and the need to develop some form of technical specification related to the digitizing of those records. Next slide, please. And this technical spec just needs to have several considerations that you may want to take into account. For example, what file format should that master copy be, or what file formats do you want those derivatives to be? Ultimately, I'd want to point people towards that technical report 22299 in order to look at what are the good practice ones. For example, you've got PDF for documentation, you've got JPEG for images, those sorts of things. Considerations around things like resolution, compression, and color management, as well as what metadata you want to have against those documents. And then again, pointing to things like BSEN 82045 Part 2 helps give you indications of the type of metadata you may want to record as a business in order to capture these things. So these are quite simple processes, but obviously more advanced techniques. You may want to include considerations around things like text or handwriting recognition, whether you are merging or splitting files, and other more complex considerations as part of that process. And this standard gives you those considerations on how to build that specification in order to do so. So my last slide, I believe, in summary, we have things like technical record 13028 that identifies how to develop a technical specification that you can embed as part of your quality control process to turn physical records into digital records that mean that there will be better access, ease of use, better protection of those records that also help improve business productivity. And by considering things like the standards relating to metadata and file formats, it means you can create something that's built for long-term preservation of that information, as well as making it suitable for searching, indexing, and otherwise. So I think these standards are quite useful resources to help turn that ink into insight. So what I'm going to do now is to pass over to Paul, and Paul's going to talk about some of the work that he's been doing around this topic. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. Firstly, sorry for the background noise if there is any. I have some issues at home with my broadband. But what I'm going to do is just to talk about a kind of some practicalities and what I've been seeing around and how different businesses are trying to get on. But before that, I thought I would kind of summarize in terms of the market challenges, why we need to standardize the way we work. We not just handle only records, but we handle data and the way we work. I'm sure you all aware, next slide please, we have issues like for data quality, we have some disasters, we have issues around the delays of the projects, and obviously it's all linked. These are kind of macro level points, but they all link back to that data quality, back to that quality of the records. Next slide, please. And on top of that, there is obviously the issues that the data are being held in silos. There's a fragmented landscape. Different records are being in different places, and the image typical image of what's happening within businesses, that the IT technology backend systems are very rarely connected to the what we call BIM or digital engineering or front end, or in some cases it's called shadow IT. So we really need to bridge the two, the IT and the business. So simply investing in BIM is insufficient to address these challenges. Next slide, please. Yeah, and obviously we are aware how's the industry changing. So I try to summarize it in different on the next slide on kind of the buzzwords, the themes we hear in the kind of the applications, what's happening. But obviously it's not exhaustive, but I would obviously highlight some of the regulation standards. A lot has happened in last probably 12 months. We have the new EN ISO 2338687. We have the series of ISO 19650 series. We have obviously the 22299, A2046 Part 2. So we have all sorts of standards, which obviously also creates complexity to the way we work in. And then obviously mentioned the Corona, post-Corona business model, new ways of working, going kind of accelerating the digitalization as well. Move to the next slide, please. Yeah, and these are some of the buzzwords, or the kind of what's really some of the statements. Modernise or die, you'll know. There's a big emphasis now in Europe on EU Green Deal. We have the Hackett report. We have initiatives around levels where the European Commission and others are looking at how, I think there is about 140 plus projects being recorded, and looking at the different levels in terms of the the environmental impacts. And there's also digital logbooks, the SAN-TC 442 group. So a lot is going on. And it's probably for businesses also difficult to keep it up. Move on, please. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, summary. I thought I just pointed out the summary of the standard I already mentioned. No need to keep stay on it for longer. Obviously, more details you could find on the BSI website or other sort of publications. But yeah, just a summary on the data, recent published data standards. Move to the next slide, please. Yeah, and I thought let's jump onto the case study. So first case study, if you how kind of demonstrating transformation from transforming the ink to the records, is really it was Cemex, where the Cemex tried to really digitize their records, looking at the standards Dan mentioned. We had to guide them through that journey as well, and they tried to really simplify the process of optimizing not just experience for their suppliers, but really streamlining process, placing orders, track orders in a real time, managing invoice payments, handing over information about their different product specification, technical guidance. Yeah, and they reckon they created a additional value in this initiative. So it's not like looking at just saving, it's creating additional value pool, back to link to the latest McKinsey report about value pools. And right now they have about 20,000 of their clients in 18 countries, and it's a great example of taking kind of traditional paper records and turning them into digitizing these records and turning them into a simple application. Next slide, please. Yeah, Aurora, I'm not sure if you're aware of Aurora. What we've been working on is trying to digitize health and safety records. It's looking at risk assessment records, automate review and improvement of risk assessment methods, and try to match different activities in new RAMs to the activities in Aurora's risk database. and returning any gaps in risks or mitigations. So yeah, so just going back to Aurora, so it's a good example how a combination of machine learning, regression, use of standards, digitizing records, how that can help really to accelerate or to kind of simplify and probably improve risk assessment, meta statement check-in. And the video, I think, is also a good example how you can, what else you can do with like a keywords, sort of identifying in keywords, how we use AI and what we test into, for example, looking at different data pools and how we can pull information from data pools and structure it against template, and how we can maybe possibly also looking at digitizing standards into a machine readable sort of template as well. Move to the next slide, please. Yeah, and this is more obviously advanced, but you can imagine when you do different things right, when the basics are right. The IBM's been working with Port of Rotterdam to looking at how we can how we can use more effectively organized shipping containers, the whole process and operation of a Port of Rotterdam. And preparing Port of Rotterdam for autonomous shipping. And there's some example of the use case where a centimeters more depth delivers largest ships is $1 million per annum. So things like delivering and predicting near real-time reliable water depth, also things like weather, so through the weather index, and analyzing, the different schedules. That kind of is showing kind of benefits, and obviously going forward, enlarging capacity to handle larger ships per days. And then the vision is then the kind of near autonomous shipping as well. Move to the next one, please. And I think that's the video has been played. So the RFP advisor, Watson assistant, has been played, and I guess that's the last slide from me. Remember, if you move to the next slide. So to summarize it back to what Dan was saying, I think it's really important to looking at how we can we combine standards, can we combine like document management guidelines with the technology. It's not there. The technology will not replace the standards. Things like what you've seen on the RFP advisor, Watson assistant. We have to train the AI to do these things. So that's why I think standards, we believe standards are the key to enable us to actually train the AI to do the repetitive tasks, so we can move on and do some gain the benefits for the businesses and do some clever stuff.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So in terms of Q&A, there are a couple of questions have come through, but we obviously encourage people to raise any questions that they have during it. In particular now, I think that we initially started with some quite basic applications of those standards, and we moved into some of the quite advanced uses, like you could see there from some of the IBM bits. So one of the questions that come through, Paul, would you mind explaining that relationship in slightly bit more detail? I think from my side, it appears to be that when you are scanning and digitizing those records, they are being enriched with either metadata or some form of semantics that are allowing questions to be asked of it as a data set. But if you could provide any more detail in terms of how that solution works, that would be great.
Yeah, so what, like I said, what we've been doing is, and for example, the Watson assistant is based on the kind of Furious training, but the idea is, yes, you have some kind of you train Watson to some keywords questions, to keywords and the questions, and then what you also can do is, as the questions have been evolved, you can enable Watson to keep further learn the questions. So an example would be, we have worked with a company called Fluor, where they perfected the use of Watson and the project health analytics and what you've seen into an extent where they used about 5 years worth of historical data. So it's also about lessons learned and mistakes. There is a quite a process in it, but the idea is that more this is getting advanced. What we want to enable to do is, as a next step, is almost to present like an iOS type of or operating system layer where businesses can start by using simple flow sections, bit like Node-RED, just basically connecting these different predefined sets and creating business workflows and triggered actions as well. So it's a lot of legwork of reusing existing assets from existing clients, but also obviously there is always a more to do. Yeah, so it's a fair bit of work to actually teach AI or Watson. It's not like it just come in automatically.
No, that's great. Thank you, Paul. So another question that's come through. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, today about standards, and many of which, to the front of them, can seem complex to some, and with obviously many public issues, things like Grenfell and other kind of notable issues that we've had in the industry. It seems that potentially, is it what we really need is a basic approach as opposed to more complicated approaches such as Watson and others. And I'll let you jump in, but I'll first just say that I think what we're trying to present here is that there are a varying degree of approaches, and that some of the bits that I think I presented initially were on the fairly basic foundational bits, where if you just wanted to scan in a document, or if you wanted to actually connect things together in a more simple sense, like photos and others, then as part of that, just following those standards we showed you will be sufficient to try and digitize some of those records up. However, at the same time, we have some real world examples from CEMEX and some of the work that IBM is doing with Watson that show how those standards can be applied in a much more comprehensive way that gives you additional benefits. And I think that one of the use cases I used to talk about was the example of if there was a mistake on a project and you could tie it back to a specific engineer that they hadn't actually done their sign-off process. A question in the business may be, well, what other projects did that person work on? And if you're able to actually apply the metadata and the additional structure to those documents, you could either search via the metadata in a document content management system to find the other projects they worked on, or like with the example Paul was showing there, you could ask the question, what other projects did Joe Bloggs act as principal or chief structural engineer or similar? So I think that what we're trying to present here is that there's a range of ways that you can do these things, which are quite simple from the documents I presented, and then range from simple to complex in some of the examples that Paul has helped present. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Paul?
Yeah, I would add on to that. You can imagine it a bit like, we use in iPhones or, Android app stores without even thinking. We use the app, we use it for what it's made of. But what you can see here is you can make it really simple and just enable the brickie or the people on site just to ask in a plain language question and just to communicate, get the instant answer, get the traceability back, and then the whole link to digital logbooks. So it is literally taking the basics, but and putting them right, but taking the complexity out of it, because like mentioned, the standards are complex, and it's probably very difficult for the SMEs to understand the standards even. And in an instant situation where you need to do something now, replace something on that side, you need an instant answer. And I think that's what we're really trying to do. Not to replace it, but to make the life easier for the people on site.
Thank you, Paul. Another question has come through about security and the security of the system. So I guess, would you mind talking about some of the security bits around some of the Watson bits? I think that from my point of view and some of the stuff I presented from the standards, obviously there should be a balanced consideration with security, and that if a record is digital, there are still security considerations, but obviously they're more on the physical security side about people breaking into the facility or otherwise. So there are always security considerations either way. So these things need to be balanced and looked at appropriately. But I wonder, Paul, if you can talk about some of the security considerations with those more clever implementations.
Yeah. So you have two types of security. We a lot talk about IT security, the infrastructure technology security, but also the big issue is, and usually overlook, is the OT security, the operational. So the machines, if you think about manufacturing or things on site, we have lots of IoT. That's usually very unsecured. So IBM is working. I'm not a security expert, but there is a lot going on, big investments going on into security. One of the things we also trying to do is decoupling data from applications. So by having the ability to containerize different applications, you can start decoupling the data, keep the data secure, and keep them with the data owners, and that's also a good way of securing it. But like I said, there's a lot of investment going on into the IT and OT security as well. So happy to provide more details, because obviously I'm not the security expert on that.
No, great. Thank you, Paul. At the moment, there don't seem to be any other questions for us. So what I will do is I will give everyone back 5 minutes of their day. And I will just say thank you very much for Paul coming to join us for this presentation. Hopefully most of you are aware, you can come and reach BSI directly or come speak to Paul and myself via various social medias. And just to let you know that BSI do a plethora of events, and that towards the end of the year, at the beginning of December, we have our Global Built Environment Conference, where both Paul and I will be speaking as well. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for attending today's webinar. We hope you found it useful and look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.